Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Gather round because it's time for a bit of YouTube drama. The good old YouTube drama. Earlier this evening, I was on the treadmill, and as I am in the habit of doing when I'm on the treadmill, I flicked on a bit of YouTube and I sort of catch up with various videos from around the place while I spend an hour or so working out on the treadmill. And one of the videos that I caught up on was one of the latest offerings from Jeremy at Geeks Gamers. Now, I should start this video by saying that while I'm not an addict, I am a regular watcher of Geeks Gamers, and I enjoy their content, and that hasn't changed for me, and I'm still going to enjoy watching what they put out. So tonight was no different. But then, to my surprise and to my absolute shock and horror, Jeremy dared to suggest, and I quote unquote here, that Brightburn, quote unquote, was more of a respectable Superman origin story than Man of Steel, end quote. Now, I just about fell off the treadmill when I heard that, and I thought to myself, this is outrageous. I am so offended. I am like a snowflake melting in the summer heat, and I have to respond. No, seriously though, I thought this is worthy of a response. So I'm going to make a response video, and this is, as I said, I'm a fan of Geeks and Gamers, so this is a friendly but unflinching disagreement. I am going to be a staunch defender of Man of Steel. I am here to defend the honor of Man of Steel, my good man, because you have sullied it with your vile and reprehensible childishness. But it is going to be friendly. It's all meant in a very friendly, good-natured kind of way. But I'm going to be unflinching in my defense. So first of all, a couple of points. I am someone who loved that old 1978 Richard Donner Superman. You know, the one that everyone has great nostalgia for, or a lot of people do. I remember as a young kid attending a play school, like that's the place you go to, preschool, which is a place you go to before you actually start primary school in New Zealand. And I remember going to a preschool fundraiser event night where they had the old reel-to-reel, the two-round reel film projector, and they played Richard Donner's Superman. That was in the early 80s, and it was like this big thing, and the parents all came along, and we're all there as kids, and we loved it. I remember also going to see it in the cinemas as a young boy. It's one of my first movie memories. It was a fun and enjoyable and very, what you might say, I don't know, typical for its era, if you like, take on the superhero genre. It's kind of campy. It's Christopher Reeve. Everyone loved him. It was a great take, a great fun take on Superman. It still is what it is. It's still a classic, but it's very much a movie of its era. Let's not pretend it's anything else. It is still very much a movie of its time, despite the fact that it is a classic. Here's the thing about Man of Steel. Man of Steel was never going to be a shot-for-shot remake of that Richard Donner film. So that was never going to happen. So that was always off the tables. So the die-hard people who, I absolutely love Richard Donner, he made the pinnacle of Superman movies, they were never going to be happy because Man of Steel was never going to be a direct shot-for-shot, like-for-like remake. So that was never, ever on the table. And Man of Steel was never going to be what you might call perhaps an indirect sequel to those that previous era, to that Richard Donner Superman either. In fact, they tried that very thing, and quite frankly, it just didn't work. And that was 2006 with Superman Returns, Brendan Roth in the lead role. It basically, that movie showed that the times had changed and that people had moved on, and that you couldn't just effectively replicate that sort of campy Superman style and then try and add in a few modern elements as well, which they tried to do in that film. In fact, I think for me what that film really proves is that you needed a new take on Superman if you were going to be successful, and that's exactly what Man of Steel did. Man of Steel, in my opinion, is an excellent film. It's not perfect, but I really enjoy it. I think it's a great piece of movie making for what it is. It's a great piece of mythology. And what it did was, more importantly, it took that mythology and it did show a great deal of respect, unlike what Jeremy has suggested in his video where he suggests that it didn't. I think what they did was they took the Superman mythology, they definitely put a more modern spin on it, but I believe they were faithful to the source material. They were faithful to the character of Superman. They were faithful to the core mythology, and they made their own, I think, very appropriate and very acceptable adaptations, even if some people subjectively didn't like those adaptations. I don't think there was anything unfaithful. I don't think they destroyed the character. I don't think they did any harm to the character with the adaptations that they chose to make. That's just what filmmaking and retelling is really all about. When you retell a classic story, you're going to have those kind of differences creep into the storytelling. And by the way, as someone who is not a die-hard, absolute must-have every edition of the Superman comics reader, someone who has read Superman comics though, I think you can also clearly see that there is a development and even a darkening of the Superman story and tone and things like that going on in the comics as well. And I've got no problem with that either. I think that's just the reality of how these stories are told. I know one of the big complaints that people had about Man of Steel, those who didn't like it, was they said that it was too dark. Superman was darker. And these seem to be some of the things that Jeremy was hinting at in his video, the way the character of Superman was acting. But to that I would say, well, so what? Nolan's Dark Knight was a much darker presentation of Batman than what we have seen previously in other Batman films, and certainly a lot darker than the old TV series, but it doesn't mean it was bad. It just means it's a different style of adaptation, and it's a subjective thing as to whether you really connect with that or not. I thought it was good because I don't think it was inappropriately dark. I don't think Superman was vile and evil and reprehensible, and I don't think, as some have suggested, he was just brooding and sinister. He was nothing like that at all. I think it's just a darker take on Superman. This is not really a big deal at all. It's a subjective disagreement, I think. Another disagreement that I've heard from people is they say they didn't like the frenetic pacing and the noise and everything else of the action. They felt it just came at you 100 miles an hour and it was just relentless and unforgiving, and they couldn't figure out what was really going on. Again, I think that's a minor and subjective complaint because I watched that film and I had no trouble, even the first time I saw it, understanding what was going on, understanding where things were at, where characters were at, and what was happening with the action. To me, I didn't see anything different there. Yep, you've definitely got that whole Zack Snyder camera movement thing going on, but to me, it's just never been a major issue for me. Again, that's a subjective thing. Some people like a different style of filmmaking and the way action is shot. This was frenetic, but what I felt that I really enjoyed about this and why I appreciated it was that the frenetic pacing and the way that he chose to shoot that action, it actually made you feel like, I suspect, what that level of action would actually feel like if it were real and possible, if super-powered beings came to Earth and had that kind of fight. And that's why so many things were getting destroyed. One of the specific complaints that Jeremy had was about Superman not saving people from buildings that he was responsible for destroying. But I think it's a little bit different when you are involved in pitch warfare to try and save the planet, much like what happens in the Avengers movies all the time, and there's collateral damage, as opposed to you simply and without any justification destroying a building full of innocent people and then doing nothing about it. So again, I'm not sure that's a particularly fair complaint. I know some people got upset about the whole final end to that, or the climax of that battle, where Superman has to end the life of the villain, and people said, well, that's not what Superman was like. But Superman didn't murder him. Superman tried to get him to stop. But General Zod was relentless and he wouldn't stop. He was a psychopath, and all Superman did in that situation was used necessary force to save humanity from this unrelenting evil. I mean, this is no different from a police officer who's in a situation where they have to actually use lethal force on a subject who is brandishing weapons and is not going to stop. And if the police don't actually stop them, they will kill a whole lot more innocent people. There was nothing morally problematic with that action at all. That word problematic gives me the heebie-jeebies. But there was nothing at all that was at issue with the morality of what we saw there. And I don't see how that's inconsistent with Superman. I know it might not necessarily be something we're used to seeing from Superman a lot, but again, to me, this is about a subjective take and a retelling of that character. So there's going to be these kind of things. They are minor differences. At one point, Jeremy talks about the fact that when he was watching Brightburn, and let me quote him here, he says, I had to look away. And he was talking about some of the violence that was on screen in Brightburn and how it made him look away. Well, the first thing I thought when I heard that was, are you really trying to suggest to me that watching a film with a level of violence that was so brutal and graphic and gratuitous that you actually had to look away, you thought that was more of a consistent presentation of a Superman type mythology than what Man of Steel was? To me, that doesn't make any sense. Like, a lot of the complaints that even you had, Jeremy, about Man of Steel, you complained about the fact that, Superman had a callousness to him, or you felt he had a callousness to him. He wasn't saving people, for example, from buildings that he'd just destroyed, etc. But the point is, if you've got a problem with that, then wouldn't you also have a problem with just this extreme level of violence in this film? And how can that be a more faithful adaptation of the Superman mythology, which is definitely not known for its barbaric and gratuitous and graphic violence at all in that way? I want to play you an actual quote here from Jeremy's video. So just to prove I'm not quoting him out of context and just to prove that, as I said, this is a friendly disagreement, but that I'm not being unfair to him. So here's just a couple of seconds of him, I guess at the pinnacle of his venting, where he explains exactly how he feels about Man of Steel. So let's watch this together.
Man of Steel is a Superman movie. It's a good alien origin movie where it's about some alien coming to Earth trying to find his way, yada, yada, yada. It's a terrible Superman movie.
And in response to that, I say, but that's exactly what the Superman mythology is all about. An alien that comes to Earth and has to try and find his way. A superpowered being on our Earth, because of his alien prowess, who has to actually learn to take that power and to put it at the service of the people on Earth, and who has to be mentored by his Earth adoptive foster parents, for want of a better term, who raise him and who teach him how to be a good man and who help to shape and mold him into the superhero he becomes. That's the whole point. That's what the Superman mythology is. Brightburn does not present that mythology. Brightburn, as far as I understand it, now I haven't seen the film yet, but as someone who hasn't seen the film, as far as I understand it, Brightburn presents the complete opposite to that. What you have is a being who is superpowered and who becomes a violent, deranged psychopath and is a danger to humanity. That's the exact opposite of the Superman mythology. That's not what Superman is all about. I mean, I don't care how many subtle nods or even overt nods to Superman comics and Superman storytelling there are in Brightburn. That doesn't mean that what it's presenting to you is more faithful to the Superman mythology than what Man of Steel was. It just means it's got maybe more nods, but even that I would think is probably disputable. Because if you take the source material and you completely change the mythology of that source material, you're not being more faithful to the source material, which is built around a particular mythology. And the mythology of Superman is what? The mythology of the Messianic Savior. It is the hero who is given this great responsibility, who comes amongst a people who at times are not always as grateful as they should be, and some of them even set themselves as villains against him, and who has to learn to use his power with virtue and put that power at the service of those people. He is a messianic figure. Brightburn is not that. Brightburn is a satanic mythology as opposed to a messianic one. In Brightburn, you have a character who experiences a fall from grace, much like Satan, who is the most powerful and beautiful of all the angels in heaven, but pride overwhelms him, his lack of virtue consumes him, and he takes his power and he uses it for evil. That's a completely different mythology to what Superman is, and by the way, it's a completely different mythology to what Man of Steel is. Man of Steel actually presents the authentic Superman mythology, the messianic one, not the satanic one. So I can't see how you can even justify that claim that this is a more faithful or a better retelling of a Superman origin story. And by the way, that was exactly the problem with The Last Jedi, wasn't it? Or pretty close to it, where you take the character and you are not faithful to the mythos of that particular character. In that case, it was Luke Skywalker. You take him and turn him into something that he is not. And I would argue that Brightburn, whether it does this well or not, definitely does something similar. It takes the concept of Superman and it presents something that is not Superman and certainly not the mythology of Superman. As I said, it's the Satanic mythology. It is not the Messianic mythology at all. Now, the second aspect of Jeremy's video that I want to pick up on was the whole question that he raised around James Gunn's involvement in this particular project. And Jeremy, I felt, again in all charity, but I felt, Jeremy, that you were being a little bit too flippant about that question of people who have chosen to deliberately boycott James Gunn projects because of their particular moral stance they've taken. They've decided they don't want to give their money to things that are going to directly support James Gunn. And you suggested that maybe that was a bit of a rabbit hole that you go down and it's sort of like there's not much clarity and you wouldn't really know. And so it's not, once you go down that rabbit hole, how far are you going to go? Here's where I disagree with you, and here's where I think you've probably missed the mark a little bit. In actual fact, there is a pretty clear moral principle here. We're getting into the area of moral philosophy here now. How do I discern the morality of my actions? And in this case, we are talking about cooperation in the actions of another person. And there are some pretty good guiding principles that we can employ around this question that don't actually lead us down a rabbit hole, as you suggested, and actually do help to clear up some of the confusion. And the key question I think you've got to ask in this situation is, if I was to buy a ticket or to spend money on this particular project, is that an act of immediate or remote cooperation in my involvement with James Gunn and his moral actions? Am I endorsing James Gunn and what he's done? Am I giving a support to that? Or is my action in buying a ticket or watching a particular project remote and remote enough that in actual fact there is no real clear connection here? I'm not actually directly cooperating with James Gunn. Now, the two questions you asked were, what if someone is friends with James Gunn and they're working on a project and you give money to that, you go and see it, pay money to watch it? Well, that quite clearly, according to the basic principles of cooperation, would not be cooperating with James Gunn at all. A person who's a friend of James Gunn's who makes a film, and you go and see that film, you are not giving any form of support or endorsement to James Gunn in that situation. So that's pretty clearly, the line there, the bright line, if you like, is pretty clear. It hasn't been crossed. The other example you said is, what if you're not aware that James Gunn was involved in a particular project? Well, again, context matters when it comes to moral questions and moral philosophy, and you need to understand the context in which an action takes place, and that includes things like a person's knowledge. And so intentionality, your intentions matter when it comes to discerning the morality of your actions. And if you were to do something without knowledge, you have far less culpability than someone who does something knowingly. Your subjective culpability as a moral subject is lessened. This is just sort of basic moral philosophy here. So if you went to see a project and you had no idea that James Gunn was involved, you're not actually deliberately intending to cooperate or endorse or support James Gunn because you don't know about his involvement. And even if he was involved and you didn't know about it, again, the question becomes, well, what was his level of involvement? And does me purchasing a ticket actually give support to him, give an endorsement to him? I think in this case, though, it's pretty clear because James Gunn, there's no question about what's going on here because James Gunn actually has a producer credit here. He's a producer on this particular project. And so if I understand the world of filmmaking correctly, then by going to see the film, by purchasing a ticket to go and see it, I am actually helping to financially, I'm giving financially to James Gunn. I'm giving a financial endorsement, if you like. It might be a tiny amount, but still I'm helping to give money to James Gunn. And I would also argue that I am helping his reputation here a little bit, to bolster his reputation by perhaps helping to progress that project on a little bit more, and that might open other doors for him. So there is pretty clearly a level of cooperation on this particular project, regardless of whether or not there might be in future projects. The second issue I have here is really your question of, isn't this just a rabbit hole? You know, you sort of seem to be implying, well, how can we really know for sure if you start down that track? Well, no, that's the whole point of morality and virtue, and this is what moral integrity is all about. You have a moral code and you live by it. And you live by it even when it's difficult to do that. Even when there might be a movie at stake that you have heard from everybody else who went to see it is a really enjoyable film. If you're going to be a man of character who sticks to his principles and you're going to be a man of virtue, then that means making a sacrifice, and you're actually going to have to walk away from the temptation to fall prey to the end justifies the means. Well, the end of having a really good movie experience justifies the means of just throwing aside my moral principles. So I actually don't think it's vague, as you've suggested. I think it is clear-cut. But, as I've said, this is a very good-natured disagreement. I've been unflinching in my positions. I've been clear on my positions, I hope. But I'm still going to watch Geeks and Gamers, and Jeremy, I still enjoy a lot of the content that you guys are producing, but you're flat out wrong about Man of Steel. And I think, quite frankly, most people would agree with me. In fact, I probably should leave the last word to Rotten Tomatoes, where Brightburn has an audience rating of 69%, and Man of Steel has 75% at this stage. And I don't see that changing too much in the near future, even with an influx of audience goers and movie viewers. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts though, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, it helps a lot. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please consider financially supporting the channel. The links for how to do that are found in the video description below. Thanks for watching. See you next time on Left Foot Media.